Moving on here, Nathan Stanley says, Mr. Whittle, thanks for answering my question last episode. You're welcome. I have another for you. As a young conservative, I'm constantly looking for gaps in our ideology and history. We can both agree that Democrats and Republicans did not switch sides, as you previously have addressed, but how and when did the left hijack the term liberal, meaning to liberate, and transfer it into today's drivel? It's a great question. First of all, if you've been listening to me for a while, you know that up until like 2 years ago or so, I would talk about liberals and conservatives and liberals. I don't use that word liberal anymore, and if I do, I catch myself and pull it back. I call them progressives. They call themselves progressives because they've used up the word liberal. So many ideas that they called liberal are just absurd, and now people don't want to hear about liberal ideas, so they keep changing their name. It's like a company with a really bad reputation, you know? A company that's just being sued constantly. They're just changing their address, and they're changing their logos, and they're changing their name, and they're changing their colors all the time because their reputation eventually catches up with them. But I think there's a better answer than that, Nathan. And to get to it, you have to start with a sentence that I use occasionally on this topic. And I don't much like the sentence because it reeks of kind of sophistry sometimes that, you can hear trial attorneys do. But nevertheless, it's true. And to understand how the term came about that way and how I feel about it, you start with this sentence. I'm a conservative because I'm trying to conserve traditional liberal values. That's what I'm trying to conserve. I'm trying to conserve classical liberalism. But what does that mean? Well, classically liberal ideas. The word liberal comes meaning to liberate, to set free. And liberal ideas are things like individual rights, inviolate individual rights that cannot be voted away. The right to protect yourself and defend yourself is a liberal idea. The idea of private property is a shockingly liberal idea. When everybody worked for the king, everybody was owned by the king or by the duke or whatever, and they could just come into your property, take whatever they want, including your wife, and force you to do whatever they want to, and that you got to keep, some pittance out of what, you made for them. The idea that you could have private property is a shockingly liberal idea. The idea that you could say whatever you want to without fear of the consequences, so long as you don't libel somebody and tell a lie, that's a fantastically liberal idea. And the individual, the ability to succeed or fail on your own merits, as Jerry did, is a liberal idea. They were liberal ideas when they came out. But liberals don't believe in any of these things anymore. Liberals don't believe in free speech anymore. They believe in protected speech. They believe that free speech can be hateful and damaging and harming, and it causes them to have trigger warnings or trigger emotions. Then they need their safe spaces, which is just another form of saying, shut up. I don't agree with you, so shut up. Your presence here on campus makes me want to seek therapy, so therefore go away, so we don't want to hear you talk. We don't want other people to hear you talk either. Because the one thing that happens now in an American college is you got to be sure that you go to a college where you don't get to hear any differing opinions of any kind. That's the main purpose of college today. And this is all a product of the left's brainwashing of America over the course of the 40 or 50 years they've been at it, and they've done it. They started out in universities in the 60s. They had communist professors teaching journalism students, and journalism students became journalism professors, and then journalism professors created an entire patch of so-called journalists who feel that the greater truth is more important than the big truth, the social truth. Yet we know that Hillary Clinton's a liar, but she's in favor of women's rights, so we're not going to report all this bad stuff because in the long term it's bad. And this is how they justify just hearing their own opinions. Yeah. Bernie's a nut in terms of his economic policies, but we're not going to ask any questions about that because we like what he's going to do. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Abu Ghraib runs 52 consecutive days on the front page of the New York Times because conservatives are evil by definition, and so we're going to destroy them. So they sweep through journalism and then pop culture, and I know an awful lot of actors, and I know an awful lot of directors and writers and people in show business, actors especially. Let me just say one thing about actors to give you an idea where this is going. If it turned out that that the popular viewpoint was to support the Iraq War, that the popular viewpoint was against gay marriage, then that's where they'd be. They just, all they want is to be adored and liked, and so they follow the same script as everybody else. I think the thing I like most about this, trying to respond to this argument of how is it that you're, what happened to the word liberal? And I've mentioned this a few times before. It's my kind of king of the hill theory. So it basically works like this. I wish I had a chalkboard in front of me. I'll try and draw it out for you. So let's imagine that, let's start over here. It's I have to do it backwards. So here's increasing human happiness, right? Awesomeness. The higher you go, the happier people are. And then down here in the origin is where we are right now. And then across this axis here is increasing activism. So as we move further and further and further, we get more and more activism. We get more and more social justice warrior types. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is, when black people are slaves, and when black people don't get to have drink out of the same water fountain, everybody who's got a soul is a liberal. People who are repulsed by that are liberals. They want to change it. And the same thing if your river's on fire. If they're pouring mercury into the river, this is where that company swinging their fist is impacted my nose. And if you don't want the rivers on fire, and if you don't want all the fish to die and stuff, then increasing environmentalism, you're a liberal. So basically what I'm saying is, if we start over here at the origin, equal rights for women, same exact thing. If you think that women should not be allowed to do certain jobs or any jobs, and you think that they shouldn't be allowed to succeed, that things should be closed off to them, they should stay home barefoot and pregnant, and they can't be any of these things except for maybe school teachers and nurses. Okay, well, if you believe that, that's fine. But people who don't believe that are liberals. They're all liberals. We were all liberals then. We were all liberals then. And so what happens is, as time goes on, activism is increasing and happiness is increasing. Swell. The problem with the progressives is they think that this is just a diagonal line that continues forever. They think that the more activism you get, the more activism you move, the happier people are going to be. But it ain't true. Because as you get to the point where as increasing activism is making people happier, that's grand. We're all liberals on that side of the curve. But when you get to the top of the curve, increasing activism, going that way, actually starts to make things worse. For example, if you don't like separate but equal, and if you think black people should have the same exact rights and opportunities as everybody else, that's great. You're a liberal and you're in favor of increasing activism. But when you get to the point where everybody has a vote and everybody has their rights protected and everybody is equal under the law, then if you continue with the activism, you start getting into things like, now we're going to start getting into things like quotas, and we're going to start getting into things like lowering standards for people. And now, as the activism continues to increase, human happiness goes down. So with the EPA, if you're in favor of keeping mercury out of the drinking water, swell. We're all liberals then. But when the EPA reaches peak effectiveness, and then they start going further, and then they start making sure that you can't open a dry cleaning store without a $7,000 or $70,000 environmental impact study to make sure, then this increasing activism is not making life better, it's making it worse. And so the curve starts to go down. And all of this is asymptotic. I don't mean to be poking graphs at you all day, but we know that a exponential curve goes like this. The further time goes on, the faster it rises. Well, an asymptotic curve is just the opposite. An asymptotic curve means that the more that time goes on, the increases get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's the truth for feminism, it's the truth for race relations, it's the truth for the EPA, just as 3 examples. When people are enslaved, you want to set them free. Great, we're all liberals on that side of the curve. But when race relations are at the point where now increasing activism means like you can't wear dreadlocks because you're not black, or the kind of feminism that says that boys are essentially defective girls and we have to medicate them so that they don't run around rowdy pointing guns, then increasing activism makes life worse. Now you're on the other side of the curve. Once you're on this downward slope where increasing activism makes things worse and worse and worse, then you want to stop and you want to go back. And that's what I want to do. I want to conserve things. I want to go back to peak happiness. And we're well past peak happiness in virtually every social arena you can think of. Some regulations, look, a lot of the myth of the robber barons is a myth. The robber barons weren't but just let's go back to like Dickens in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Yes, I would like to have laws that keep children out of the factories. And yes, I'd like to have safety laws. And yes, I like an 8-hour day, 5 days a week instead of a 10-hour day, 6 days a week. Yes, that's fine. We're all liberals then. But when unions start demanding so much money for people to literally sit around and do nothing, at LA Unified School District right now, there are something like 6,000 teachers that are paid not to teach because they've committed these horrible disciplinary problems, but they can't get fired because the teachers union just simply will not let then it doesn't work anymore. You've gone too far. You have to back up. You have to go back up to where the top of the curve is. You want to go back to be king of the hill. So as long as progress is improving things, activism is a better word than progress, because progress is progress. As long as increasing activism is making people happier, then I'm a liberal. But as the second that increasing activism starts making life worse, I'm a conservative. I want to stop doing this destructive thing, and if I have to go backwards a little bit to where things were better, that's where I'll go. As I was saying, things like, child labor laws, good. Having now the 37th freest economy in the world, where all of these licenses and all of this red tape and all these forms and all these taxes means you can't go out and do things for people, make their lives better the way Jerry did with Beta Analytic. When you now have so many regulations that we're not talking about mercury in the rivers now. Now we're talking about, have you fully complied with the and people are going out of business because of these regulations and these taxes. Now we're past peak optimal happiness. We're past peak regulation. Now it's time to back up, stop, conserve, go backwards, back to where it was better. And in some areas, although not coming to mind right now, if things continue, I can't think of a single thing where we're not past peak awesomeness. Space programs past peak awesomeness, all of it. We've just gone too far. And once we get, I'll just wrap this up by saying this. Let's say that the EPA is designed to clean up the environment, and it was. Great. So it has a huge job ahead of it. And it took 30 years to do the job. Those of us who are old enough remember people just chucking bags of garbage out of the car and the black streaks behind airplanes when they took off and little puffs of blue smoke coming out of the back of every car and stuff. Fine. As long as they're cleaning up the environment from actual toxins, great. But then, when they've accomplished their mission, what do? Their budgets never get smaller. They get bigger all the time. And they never say, well, let's all give ourselves a big pat on the back and dissolve this organization now. We've got sensible regulations in place that need to stay in place. No. Then they have to start looking for things to do. And as all of the easy things and the important things are done, then they have to start looking for smaller and smaller and more nuisance things that have a smaller and smaller payoff. And next thing you know, you've got an agency that has 5 times the budget it started with, trying to do half of 1% of the work it originally did. And it just gets ridiculous and ludicrous. So that's how I think I would deal with that. We were all liberals when being a liberal made people happier. But this idea that constant increasing activism to the point of, like I said, this cultural appropriation nonsense and this safe space nonsense and all the rest of it, that's increasing advocacy, and it's ridiculous. Time to stop and go back a little bit.